A poor single mom leaves her seat on a flight, but when she returns, a handsome stranger is waiting. I never imagined that the man with whom I shared so many years of marriage could be capable of something like this. The blow came in a silent and cruel way, like a punch in the stomach that I never saw coming. After years of struggles, sacrifices, and promises of a future together, I discovered in the worst possible way that my name was no longer part of the house where I had lived for so long. He had erased me from our history without even warning me. That morning, I left for work as usual, unsuspecting of anything amiss. But upon returning, I realized that something was wrong. My key wouldn't turn in the lock. My heart raced. I tried opening the door again, with force, as if the problem lay in my trembling hands rather than the brutal reality that awaited me. I called my husband, but my calls went straight to voicemail. Then, I saw the envelope on the floor next to the door. Inside, a terse note read, "Don't come back. Your name is no longer on the house." I felt the world spin. I ran to a notary, desperate to understand what was happening. It was there that the truth hit me like an electric shock. Months earlier, he had transferred the house into his name by forging my signature on the documents. The place I had helped build, for which I paid the bills, where I dreamed of a future, was now his alone. The coldness of the blow left me breathless. I had been erased from my own life, without even a proper farewell. That night, I sat on a bench in an airport, clutching the only suitcase I managed to grab before being thrown out. I no longer had a home. I no longer had a husband. I only had an airplane ticket and a desperate plan. A few weeks earlier, I had received a job offer in Seattle. A boutique hotel was offering an assistant manager position with housing included. It was my only option. If I had once hesitated to change cities, now there was no choice. With what little I had left, I bought a ticket for a red-eye flight. While I waited for boarding, my eyes fixed on the lights of the planes in the tarmac. A promise formed within me. I was not just going to survive. I was going to rebuild myself. And when that happened, he would regret every decision he made. The plane to Seattle took off shortly after midnight. A silent, nearly empty flight. I settled into the window seat, exhausted, and still trying to process everything that had happened. The weight of betrayal crushed me, but I knew I couldn't succumb to the pain. The only thing I had left now was the future. I needed to believe that something good could still happen. I dozed off for a few minutes, but I woke up to the gentle rocking of the plane. I turned to the side and noticed that someone had taken the seat next to me. It was an elegant man, dressed in an impeccable suit, yet with a tired look in his eyes. He was bent over the tray table, idly drawing with a pen on the airplane's safety card. I shouldn't have cared, but something about the scene caught my attention. "Do you draw?" I asked, trying to divert my mind from the chaos that was my life. He looked up and smiled subtly. His eyes held that familiar melancholy of someone who has already lost something important. "I used to," he replied, turning the card toward me. The drawing was of a bear holding a balloon, detailed and full of life. There was something in the simplicity of the lines that touched me in an unexpected way. We talked a little afterwards. His name was James, and he was an architect. He was on his way to Seattle for an important project. Gradually, he revealed more about himself. He had lost his daughter, Lily, 2 years ago, a victim of a cruel illness. The pain in his voice was evident, but what struck me the most was the affection with which he spoke of her. It was as if, in some way, she was still there with him. I wanted to avoid talking about myself, but when he asked what brought me to Seattle, I couldn't lie. I told him about the job offer, about the hope of a fresh start. But before I could continue, he frowned upon hearing the name of the hotel. His expression grew serious. "That hotel," he began, taking his phone and typing something. "It doesn't exist." The chill I felt in that moment was worse than any turbulence. My only plan, my only hope. Was it a lie? My heart pounded. With every word from James, my body felt heavier, as if sinking into an endless nightmare. I reopened my email, trying to find something to prove that he was wrong. But deep down, I already knew. I wanted so badly to believe that the offer was real that I ignored the obvious signs. The hotel's name, the address, nothing existed. I had fallen for a scam. The truth hit me with such force that I was left breathless. My eyes began to burn, and all I could do was grip the side of the seat tightly. as if that could stop the world from collapsing. I had already lost my home, my marriage, and now my last chance to start over was slipping away before my eyes. I was on my way to a city where I had nothing. No plan, no place to stay, no money to go back. James fell silent for a moment. He didn't seem uncomfortable with my despair, and that, in a way, made me feel less alone. He took the printed card I had been carrying and examined every detail with the careful eye of an architect used to dealing with contracts and large projects. Then, without hesitation, he said something I never expected. "You can stay in one of my company's apartments until you get back on your feet." I looked at him, trying to understand if this was some sort of joke. Who offers an apartment to a stranger they just met on a flight? Every part of me screamed to refuse, to not trust. But at the same time, what else could I do? I was out of options. I needed to accept help. The journey continued in heavy silence after that. I tried to sleep, but the weight of uncertainty kept me awake. It was incredible to think that just a few hours earlier, I believed my life was about to change for the better. Now, I was heading into the unknown, not knowing what to expect. Yet somehow, something about James gave me a sense of security. Perhaps it was the calm tone of his voice. Perhaps it was the fact that he knew what it was like to lose everything. The plane landed in Seattle before dawn. I didn't know what would come next, but one thing was certain. That flight had changed everything. The Seattle airport was cold and silent at that hour of the early morning. As we walked through the corridors toward the exit, I tried to absorb the reality of what was happening. My life had changed drastically in less than 24 hours. I had no home, no job, and now I was about to get into the car of a man I had met just a few hours earlier on a flight. James walked beside me with a calm expression, but I sensed that he too was dealing with his own ghosts. He spoke briefly on the phone, informing someone that they would be arriving soon. His posture was that of someone used to handling complicated situations, but the fatigue in his eyes betrayed a burden much heavier than he let on. When we left the terminal, a black car was already waiting for us. The driver opened the door for us without any questions. At that moment, I felt like a character in a scene that wasn't my own. I, a betrayed and lost woman, sitting in the seat of a luxurious car next to a man who clearly belonged to a world completely different from mine. During the ride, James told me a bit more about the apartment. It was a small unit in one of the buildings owned by his company, located in a safe neighborhood. He assured me that I could stay there as long as I needed, with no pressure. Although it was a generous offer, something inside me still hesitated. I didn't want to depend on anyone. And what if it was just another illusion? I had trusted too much once and paid a high price for it. But then I looked at the back seat, where Tommy, the 4-year-old son I had forgotten to mention, was sleeping while clutching his teddy bear. I had no right to refuse help out of pride. I needed a fresh start. And as terrifying as it was to trust a stranger, perhaps this was the only possible path. We arrived at the building just before dawn. The place was simple, yet well located, surrounded by quiet streets and a small square with a playground right in front. James got out of the car first and took a keychain from his pocket, unlocking the building's door as if it were already part of his routine. He didn't seem to hesitate to help me, and that left me both grateful and cautious. The apartment was on the 3rd floor, a modest unit but clean and well lit. When I stepped inside, a strange relief took over me. After losing everything, being in a space that was at least minimally safe felt like a victory. It wasn't mine, but at least it was a roof over my head. Tommy was still asleep in my arms, and I carefully laid him on the mattress that James had indicated in the small bedroom. While I was tidying up some things, I noticed that James hesitated at the doorway of the living room, as if he wanted to say something but didn't know how. Finally, he took a deep breath and spoke. "You don't have to trust me, I understand. But if you need anything, my number is on the card." There was something in his voice that sounded sincere. A deep weariness, a pain I recognized because I carried my own. It was as if, in some way, we were two strangers united by different losses, but equally profound. Before leaving, he looked for a moment at Tommy, who was sleeping while hugging his teddy bear, and almost whispered to himself, "He reminds me of someone." That night, alone in that small apartment, I thought about what James had told me about his daughter, the pain of losing someone so definitively, and then, for the first time since it all happened, I realized that perhaps my loss wasn't the end of my story. Perhaps it was just the beginning of something I still didn't understand. In the following days, I tried to get my life back on track. The first step was to look for a real job, something that would allow me to support Tommy without relying on anyone. I spent hours walking around the city, handing out resumes, facing rejections and closed doors. It wouldn't be easy, but I had learned that nothing in my life came without a fight. James didn't show up in the first few days, but he sent a short message asking if I needed anything. There was a respectful distance in the way he helped me, never making me feel like a burden. Even so, I still wondered why he had done that. Why offer an apartment to a complete stranger? The answer came unexpectedly. One afternoon, as I was returning from the market with Tommy, I saw James sitting on a bench in the park in front of the building. He was watching the children play, but his gaze was distant, fixed on a time that no longer existed. Something inside me urged me to go over to him. I sat beside him without saying a word. We sat in silence for a while, until he finally spoke. Lily loved parks. This one reminds me of the ones we used to frequent. Then he began to tell his story. His daughter had been diagnosed with leukemia at the age of 2. It was 2 years of struggle, countless trips to the hospital, shattered hopes, and sleepless nights. He had tried everything, sought out the best doctors, paid for experimental treatments, but in the end, nothing was enough. Lily was gone, and with her, the woman he loved. Rachel, his wife, was never able to cope with the pain. She left a few months later, taking with her whatever remained of the family. When you appeared on that flight, desperate for a fresh start, I recognized that look. It was the same look I saw in the mirror after I lost everything. In that moment, I understood. James wasn't just helping me, he was trying to find meaning in his own pain. Somehow, by reaching out to me, he was trying to transform his loss into something meaningful, and perhaps in a way that neither of us yet fully understood. Our paths were meant to cross. The days turned into weeks, and little by little my life began to take shape again. I got a job as a receptionist at a busy cafe in downtown, a simple job that allowed me to pay the bills without depending on anyone. Tommy was happy with the new routine, and seeing his smile made it all worthwhile. As difficult as it had been, I was rebuilding my life. James continued to be present in a discreet way, never overstepping boundaries but always offering support when I needed it. Our bond grew silently, unhurriedly. He helped me find a school for Tommy, recommended safe places to look for permanent housing, and on some evenings, we simply talked about life. 2 survivors of different losses, learning to move forward. But then something unexpected happened. One afternoon, when I returned to the apartment, I found a white envelope slid under the door. When I opened it, I felt my body shudder. It was filled with photographs. In each one, James and I appeared together. Some showed our meeting in the park, others were taken at the cafe where I worked, and a few captured small moments, like him holding the door for me or handing me a book he had recommended. Next to the photos, a single handwritten phrase read, "The board of directors might find this interesting." My mind went on high alert. This was a warning, a threat. Someone was trying to get to us. James arrived shortly after and found the photos scattered on the table. His face immediately turned serious. He picked up one of the photos and frowned as he recognized the handwriting. It was Rachel. His past was coming back in full force, and this time, I was part of the target. The threat in the photos was clear, but what worried me most was what it meant for James. Rachel hadn't gotten over her loss, and now, seeing him rebuild his life in some way, she seemed determined to destroy him. I didn't know exactly how far she would go, but the tension in James's eyes said it all. This was serious. He explained that even after the divorce, Rachel still had influence within the family business. If she could convince the board that James was involved in something inappropriate, he could lose everything. She knew exactly where to strike. It wasn't about money, but about power, about hurting him in the deepest way possible. She still believes that by punishing me, she can bring Lily back, he said, gripping one of the photos tightly. I wanted to say something to ease his pain, but there were no words that could mend a heart so shattered. So, I did the only thing I could. I stayed by his side. In the following days, things grew tenser. Rachel began spreading rumors within the company, insinuating that James was using company resources for personal favors. No names were mentioned, but it was obvious she was referring to me. And meanwhile, new anonymous notes started appearing. She wanted to scare me. She wanted me to give up before things got worse. I thought about leaving, about walking away from the apartment and starting over somewhere else. But this time, running away wasn't the answer. I had already lost everything once. I wasn't going to lose again. So, we made a silent pact. If Rachel wanted to fight, she would find out that we wouldn't fall so easily. Rachel didn't give up. She was willing to do anything to see James crumble. The next day, he was called into an emergency board meeting at the company. Accusations were flying. They claimed that he had used company resources for personal interests, insinuating that he was financially supporting someone, me, a desperate attempt to tarnish his reputation. While James faced the executives, I stayed in the apartment trying to process it all. I didn't want to be a burden to him. I knew that if Rachel achieved what she wanted, he would lose the only thing he still had, his career. And somehow, after everything I had lost, I knew how much that meant. Then my door was abruptly opened. Rachel. She burst in like a storm, her eyes full of hatred and pain. She didn't just want to remove me from James's life. She wanted to destroy me. Do you think you can just show up and take what isn't yours? Her voice trembled with anger. I did not back down. Not this time. I never wanted to take anything from you, Rachel. But you have to accept that what happened to Lily is not anyone's fault. She laughed, but there was no humor in her face. It was an empty laugh from someone who had lost so much that she no longer knew how to move on. Do you really think I can just accept and move on? That I can watch him drawing little bears for another woman's child and find that normal? Lily died, and he went on with his life. Then I understood everything. It wasn't about me. It wasn't even about James. It was about her pain, about the void Lily had left behind, about how seeing James help someone else start over was unbearable because it meant he had found a way, and she had not. She looked at me one last time, expecting me to respond, to defend myself, to say something that would justify all that she felt. But I just stood there, seeing not an enemy, but a woman broken by pain. And then she simply left. Hours later, James returned. He had won the battle. The board didn't find enough evidence against him, and Rachel had finally lost her hold on him. But the most important thing was that day, she finally realized that she could no longer keep us trapped in the past. The following days were strangely quiet. Rachel disappeared. No new threats, no new notes. It was as if, suddenly, she had given up. But I knew it wasn't that simple. She hadn't lost to us. She had lost to herself. James continued with his life, lighter than I had ever seen him. He was free, not only from Rachel's influence, but from the silent guilt he had carried since Lily's death. For the first time, he seemed ready to move forward, not because he was trying to escape the pain, but because he had finally accepted that life goes on. As for me, I finally felt that I had found a home. I managed to rent my own apartment, Tommy was happy at school, and my job promoted me to an administrative position. After so long, I was no longer a lost woman trying to survive. I was someone rebuilt. But then, something happened. Something that, to this day, I cannot explain. One afternoon, upon returning to the apartment after work, I found a white envelope on the table. There was no sender, no indication of who had left it there. Inside was a single drawing, a teddy bear holding a balloon. In the lower corner, a small, delicate signature. Lily. My heart stopped. It was impossible. Lily had died years ago. I looked around trying to find a rational explanation, but there was nothing. No clue. Just the drawing, waiting to be understood. When I showed it to James, he was silent for a long time. His eyes lit up, and a gentle smile appeared on his face. Perhaps some things don't need to be explained. And in that moment, I knew he was right. The past had finally found its peace. If this story has touched your heart, share it with someone who needs this message of hope. Subscribe for more inspiring stories of overcoming adversity and courage. Join our community to be moved by real stories of strength and transformation.